Like there would be no way that you could operate. So you just got to learn to like sit in those moments and be like, well, hey, I mean, it always could be worse, like we're here in the desert doing some dumb army work, but man, it could be worse, but I can't wait to get home. Like there's ways that coping happens, you know, and like those bonds, it's almost like trauma bonding where like you have very tight relationships because it's so extreme, and you have really tightness with that group of people. So I think what makes that hard is like that's a hard thing to replicate outside of those environments, Mm-hmm. I think sports teams do it very well, obviously at every level. They're like a building block to doing that. The Army is not even a building block, it's an extreme version of that. So then how do you set yourself up for goals to have this in the civilian world? Like what do you do to give yourself enough friction that's comfortable and achievable, but also challenging so that you have a reason to have motivation and a reason to maybe lead somebody and like really drive into some of that purpose. And I think some of goal setting, like that happens for us.
Yeah.
I think setting a physical goal and challenges is really one of those fundamental pillars that everyone should do to get themselves out of comfort zone and feel friction and maybe develop a team or teamwork with people that you have to opt into because it's not a part of your job, but you find a way to do it.
Yeah.
So going into goals.
I knew you were going to go here. I was thinking the same thing, but no, before we do that though, I think there is something to be said about, because getting into the tail end of that conversation, it becomes about culture, which is a whole other podcast in itself. But I find that shit really interesting. And because I mean, you can look at culture on the most micro sense or the most macro sense. Like, I mean, you could talk about whole towns, you could talk about organizations. And having been on two opposite sides of that, where it's like in high school, like we didn't really have a strong sense of culture, where it's like, other schools, like football games, you're going all out. Like you're doing this after, we had maybe a little bit, but I know now it doesn't exist anymore. Like all that stuff is gone. And I just find it so interesting that like it comes and goes in different ways. I mean, it just depends on what it is. But anyway, yes, getting into goals. I mean, we'll talk about that later, but yeah. So goals for 2024.
Setting goals for 2024.
What goals do we have? What goals have we set?
How
do we set them? Yeah.
How do you set goals? Okay. So the how goes to what we were talking about a little bit. So the way that I've been thinking of goals for this next year for myself, I'm setting personal goals, professional goals, the whole works, right? I think I've learned about myself that I need competitions. So I set a lot of goals based on replicating those competitions. The competition structure is where I start basing things off of, and having events to go to is where I think the biggest building blocks for my goals are set. So personally, I'm setting some fitness goals that are related to doing the tactical games again in May when they come to Pittsburgh. And so I'm setting a standard of like, okay, well, that's in May. What can I start working on now? Because I don't need a 6-month training program necessarily. Isn't going to be identical to the first few months versus the last few months. So I'm setting that up as a fitness goal that's related to what can I achieve, get to another step. What's that next step going to look like? And what have I learned from doing the tactical games specifically last year that I need to work on is a really big one.